Hi, good afternoon. Hello. Wow, I'm used to church people. They say hi. 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 Great. Woo. What did I do? I did it.
Press the little slidey bottom.
Little slidey thing at the bottom.
Here, go down, down.
Down, down, down.
Right.
To my right, to my right. This thing?
No,
Nope.
next one back. Second.
Great. Yeah, I'm doing great. Doing great. Want to hear it again? A few weeks ago, as I scanned the Heidegger section of my bookshelf to prepare to write this talk, I confess I felt a familiar dread surround me. Here we go, back to Heidegger. Why did I say I'd talk about Heidegger? Couldn't I have volunteered to do anyone else? See, the thing is, I've spent a lot of time with the man, but I still find him totally baffling. Not any proposition in particular, not the near insanity of his neologisms, not the mystery surrounding his disastrous politics, just the whole thing, the whole Heidegger. And I think the source of this bafflement is the universal character of his thinking. And by this, I don't mean that his thinking holds for everyone. What I mean is that it functions as its own universe, the Heideverse, a self-enclosed holographic system in which everything swirls around the everything else it already presumes, and the whole thing is covered in a thick shell of impregnable syntax. Existence, he tells us, is the being of those beings who stand open for the openness of being in which they stand by standing it. What? So we read and our eyes glaze and we read more because that didn't make sense. So maybe this will, but no, it won't until finally, days or months or years later, something does. Something makes sense. You sense you get what's going on, and in your exuberance race to explain it to yourself, to a friend, to the parent who's been asking what you're planning to do with that certificate in theory, and you say, I'm learning the truth of my existence, Uncle Bill, that's important. And he, reaching for another Miller Lite at the barbecue, says, but what do you mean your existence? And you find yourself saying, what I mean by existence is the being of those beings who stand open for the openness of being in which they stand, by standing it. And your exhilaration collides with total despair as you realize you're trapped. You're trapped inside the very holographic Heideverse you've spent so long locked out of. How did you get in? Where was the door? And now it makes sense, but it makes his sense. You can say it in his language and feel somehow that you get it, but you can't translate because everything requires everything else, and you're scared that if you step out of the syntactical resonance machine, you might not make it back in. So you stay there, standing the openness of the open in which you stand while your roommates plot to lock you out on the roof of your wood frame house the next time you say Dasein. My hope today is to find one way into a particular patch of the Heideverse, one way that might allow us to glimpse this world from the inside, to catch sight of a few wormholes we can throw ourselves into later on, and even to play around in this bizarre world without losing sight of things like historical context, philosophical precedents, and words that make sense. By standing between worlds in this way, I realize that I risk losing hold of Heidegger altogether. But it could be that maintaining a certain betweenness is the very task of thinking for Heidegger, holding oneself between the sensible and the senseless, the thought and the unthought, the ordinary and the very strange. It is, at the very least, where I will try to stay, mindful that the alternative might well be spending the night on the Downey House roof. I'll be calling my talk today, One Way Up Through the Way Back Into the Out of Ontotheology. At issue in the Heideversal path we'll be exploring this afternoon is the critique of metaphysics as ontotheological. I'll be asking what that means and why it matters, calling upon two relatively short texts. The first is the 1949 preface to Heidegger's What is Metaphysics, entitled The Way Back into the Ground of Metaphysics, which I will refer to, for the sake of shorter sentences, as the WB. The second is the concluding installment to Heidegger's lecture series in 1956 to 57 on Hegel's Science of Logic, a piece that Heidegger calls On the Ontotheological Constitution of Metaphysics, which I will clearly have to call the OC. I'll be putting the longer quotations up on the screen so you can read along, and the page numbers on the screen will refer to the page numbers of the readings Professor Fitzpatrick has distributed to the students in the theory class, readings that I'm happy to send as PDFs to anybody who'd like to spend more time with them, so just let me know. To those who can read, Heidegger writes in the OC, metaphysics is ontotheology. So right from the outset, we know this is important because the sentence is far shorter and more declarative than Heidegger's usually are, and because he's channeling Jesus. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. To those who can read, he writes, metaphysics is ontotheology. But what does that mean, metaphysics is, I can read, what does that mean, metaphysics is ontotheology? What's metaphysics, what's ontotheology, and perhaps most pressingly, what's is? Happily, the term metaphysics has a fairly straightforward meaning for Heidegger. In ordinary usage, we tend to call metaphysics that branch of philosophy that deals with notions of ultimate reality, that is, with the stuff above or beyond the order of nature. Metaphysics dukes it out over what being is, or whether or not God is, or where the real is located, while ethicists and logicians and theory of mind people get on with the more sober work of proper philosophy. As someone who spends a good deal of time with metaphysicians, I tend to think of them as playing in the ball pit at IKEA while their parents go shopping. You know, it's like they're tumbling around in these multicolored balls while their parents are picking out the sort of storage structures that are going to make the house work. But this isn't what Heidegger means by the term. When Heidegger says metaphysics, he means the whole history of Western philosophy, all the way from Plato or in his more dismal moods from the pre-Socratics through Hegel. He means that calculative kind of thinking in which a thinking subject represents beings as objects, a thinking which furthermore maps this subjective-objective split onto a host of other dualisms, substance versus accident, eternal versus temporal, form versus matter, etc. Now Heidegger says that this tradition was overturned by Friedrich Nietzsche, who revealed the so-called intelligible realm as an unstable product of the sensible realm. This, Heidegger, is what Nietzsche's madman means when he runs through the marketplace crying that God is dead. Heidegger writes, the pronouncement God is dead means the suprasensory world is without effective power. It bestows no life. Metaphysics, that is, for Nietzsche, Western philosophy understood as Platonism, is at an end. So Nietzsche proclaimed the end of Platonism, and he overturned it, but he didn't overcome it, says Heidegger. Nietzsche still remains within the confines of metaphysics because in Heidegger's often strained interpretation of him, in order to free himself from God and the forms, some other world as the site of ultimate value, Nietzsche consolidated the human subject as the site of ultimate value. God is dead, the madman says, and we have killed him. This theocidal human subject becomes, for Heidegger's Nietzsche, quote, the executor of unconditional will to power, unquote. The one who ultimately determines the value of being in the absence of transcendence, and for that reason, the human subject becomes the master of being itself. Man enters into insurrection, Heidegger writes in the same essay on Nietzsche. The world changes into object. In this revolutionary objectifying of everything that is, the earth moves into the midst of human positing and analyzing. The earth can show itself only as the object of assault, an assault that in human willing establishes itself as the unconditional objectification, Nature appears everywhere as the object of technology. And this totally technologized world is the culmination for Heidegger of the philosophical tradition that begins with Plato, an objectifying way of thinking that has gradually turned the whole earth into an object of assault. For this reason, the task of thinking for Heidegger will not just be to overturn metaphysics by reversing its traditional privileges, humans over God, darkness over light, etc., but rather to overcome it, to find a way to get thinking on a totally different course. And for Heidegger, this will require overhauling our sense of what it means for a human, or anything else for that matter, to be. This is the reason that Heidegger opens his OC lecture by saying he's doing precisely the opposite of what Hegel did. Always dangerous to oppose Hegel. It's very likely there's a place for your no and his yes, but this is nevertheless the way Heidegger announces the first part of the project. He's saying, I'm doing exactly the opposite of what Hegel's doing. Hegel did, right? For Hegel, as Professor Rouse taught us last week, the course of history enacts a series of progressive formations of consciousness, from objective consciousness to self-consciousness to reason to spirit. And once consciousness becomes conscious of itself as spirit, it realizes spirit was there all along, working its way through the long run of history. The Hegelian task, then, is first to put these formations of consciousness in order, to tell the story of the gradual unfolding of spirit in and as human consciousness, and to begin thereby the work of actualizing it. Spirit, one can say, is realized, made real, as it is realized, or brought to human consciousness. In Heidegger's language, what this means is that the history of being for Hegel, the history of what is equivalent to the history of thinking. What is what has come to consciousness. In this light, looking back over the past 2,500 years of post-Parmenidean thought allows Hegel to see being progressively unfolding in philosophy until it culminates in the idea, which is to say, the absolute coincidence between subject and object, knower and known. And it's here that Heidegger announces his reversal of Hegel. If the task for Hegel is to think what has been thought in Western philosophy, the task for me, Heidegger, is to think what has not been thought in Western philosophy. If Hegel is looking to consummate metaphysics, Heidegger is looking to overcome it. And strikingly, what has been thought for Hegel and what's not been thought for Heidegger are the same thing, which is to say, being itself. Philosophy for Heidegger has never been able to think being. Opa, says the philosophy student, ducking out of the Heideverse, dusting herself off. Philosophy talks about being all the time. Parmenides says it's one, Heraclitus says it's many, Plato puts it in forms, Anselm puts it in God, Maimonides splits it apart so Aquinas can glue it together, Leibniz splinters it into monads, Hegel glues it back in spirit. All these guys ever talk about is being. To which Heidegger might reply, not so, deluded Dasein. Philosophy says it talks about being. It thinks about being, but really it only thinks about beings. It asks, what is a table? What is the good? What is a human being? And it thinks about tables and goodness and human beings. But in asking what any of these things is, it never thinks to ask what is. Until Bill Clinton, nobody ever thought to ask what is. Right. So philosophy thinks about beings all the time, but not about being itself. Now, of course, the crazy thing about this philosophic forgetting of being is that being is what allows beings to be in the first place. It's what allows philosophy to be in the first place. What would philosophy be without asking what is? Being is the condition of possibility of metaphysics. Metaphysics can't get off the ground without it, and yet metaphysics has never been able to think it. The illustration in the WB essay is that metaphysics sees the beings it sees in the light of being, but it can't see the light itself. Metaphysics, in a different metaphorical register, grows like a tree from the ground of being, but the leaves of this tree can't reach the soil. The leaves of ethics and logic, philosophy and psychology. They forget the element that allows the tree to be in the first place. The language shifts a bit, as you may have noticed in the OC lecture 8 years later. Here, it's not so much being that metaphysics can't think, but rather the difference between being and beings. It's difference in this essay that gives rise to the distinctions within which metaphysics operates, matter and form, good and evil, eternal and temporal. All of that is opened spatially and temporally by difference in the OC essay. It's therefore in that essay, difference as such, that metaphysics can't think. And this is one place where Heidegger begins to blend into the early Derrida, whom Professor Kleinberg will be speaking about in a few weeks' time. Différence, although Derrida might balk at the suggestion, arguably operates in the placeless place of what Heidegger first called being. Right? Différence is not, Derrida tries here to push back even behind ontology, but it operates prior to the distinction of metaphysics as the spatializing and temporalizing condition of their opening, and in this sense can be heard as irreducibly Heideggerian for those who have ears to hear, right, if you want to do it that way. Turning back to Heidegger, this language of the light or the ground or being or difference as difference, the language is refined as the years go on. He notoriously would sort of make up words, ditch them, make up other words, ditch them, right? This is just, he's trying to get at the same thing. Derrida has this image of a great thinker being one who can only think one thought over and over and over again. And the one thought crashes like a wave on the sand over and over again. This same thought keeps crashing for Heidegger. It brings with it different kelp, right? There's the kelp of the light or the kelp of being or the kelp of difference, but it's the same wave, right? The issue is metaphysics' inability to think that which sets it in motion. But as critical as Heidegger is of this tradition, he also acknowledges that it's not exactly metaphysics' fault that it can't think that which sets it in motion. After all, to remain with the term being, the first kelp wave, for the sake of convenience, if being conditions thinking, if being gets thinking going in the first place, then the moment you go to think at all about anything, you're already presupposing being. Even if we manage to make it to the point of asking, what is being, we're assuming we already know what the is, what it would mean for being to be, and so we can't ever ask what being is because we can't get back behind that by means of which the questioning already operates, which is to say, being itself, which is the thing that we're trying to investigate, right? So this is the problem. Metaphysics operates, Heidegger says, by means, this is in the WB essay, of a prior conception of being, a relentlessly prior, maddeningly anterior conception of being that the moment we go looking for it springs up like a hedgehog in his race against the hare to proclaim, I'm already here. Oops. Sorry, right? But again, this isn't so much a failure of metaphysics as it is the condition of possibility of metaphysics itself. As Heidegger explains it in another register, being doesn't ever just present itself. Right? Being presents itself in beings, which is to say, being conceals itself as being, even as it reveals itself in beings. The soil enables the tree to grow, but it hides itself as soil. Or in Heidegger's increasingly Delphic prose, the ground of metaphysics eludes it because in the rise of unconcealedness, its very core, namely concealedness, stays away in favor of the unconcealed, which appears in the form of beings. Right? This is to say that being hides itself as being, that's the concealedness. In order to show itself in beings, that's the unconcealed. So when metaphysics attunes itself to these beings, these unconcealed, it misses that which conceals itself in order to unconceal beings as such. In philosophy's frenzy to calculate, represent, and catalog everything that is, philosophy misses isness itself. What is at stake here, Heidegger writes, is therefore not a series of misunderstandings of a book, but our abandonment by being. Our abandonment by being. Being, Heidegger says, turns us over to the frenzied objectification of beings, turns beings over to us as objects, turns all of us over as objects to one another, precisely by withholding itself from us. Right? I'm not going to get into this mess. Right? We're all abandoned to one another. Beings have been abandoned by being, forsaken, he says at one point. And what better sign we've been abandoned by being than the rise of modern technology? According to Heidegger, the effect of metaphysics' attention to beings at the expense of being has been the objectification of those beings, the representation of beings only insofar as they're useful to human consumption. And so a river becomes a resource for energy, a cow becomes a commodity, and a mountaintop becomes an obstacle between us and the coal it contains, coal which of course is a resource. The sum of resources, the stockpile for technological advancement, is the sum of what is in Heidegger's atomic age. All that is has been calculated in advance in terms of its usefulness to the manic advancement of, quote, functionalization, systematic improvement, automation, bureaucratization, communications, unquote. And this endless technocratic advancement, supposedly undertaken for the sake of man, culminates in the thingification of man himself, who at this point has become just another part of the stockpile. This is why we're going to need a new beginning for thinking, another thinking that might think being itself, or as Heidegger begins to say in his later writings, a thinker that might let being be. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In order to find a new beginning for thinking, Heidegger insists we first have to think the first beginning of thinking, that which thinking has never been able to think. And in order to think the first beginning, we have to get clear about what it is that's been preventing us from thinking the first beginning in the first place. Which means that even before we can see why we haven't thought the first beginning, we first have to realize that we haven't been able to think it. We first of all need to face up to our oblivion of being, a function of our having been abandoned by being. And this recognition, Heidegger says, can only instill in us a genuine horror. Because if being has withdrawn from beings, ourselves included, then beings, strictly speaking, cannot be. And yet they are. So beings neither are nor are not. Their existence in the modern age is a shadowy, forsaken kind of half-existing. It is this horror we have to face up to first of all. And then we can begin to figure out how we got here. From the outset, Heidegger tells us, metaphysics has been ontotheologically constituted. What on earth does that mean? Although Heidegger can be said to have popularized the term, if one can speak all that buzz in Entertainment Weekly about ontotheology, flying off the shelves. Heidegger actually borrows the word from Immanuel Kant. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant uses the term ontotheology to designate the philosophical effort to prove God's existence a priori. One might think here of St. Anselm's famous demonstration. As you may recall, Anselm says that what we mean by God is that than which a greater cannot be thought, which doesn't sound any better in Latin than it sounds in English. What we mean by God is that than which a greater cannot be thought. And since it's greater to exist than not to exist, that than which a greater cannot be thought must in fact exist. This is the sort of reasoning that Kant dismisses as ontotheology, as distinct from cosmotheology. And cosmotheology is the line of argumentation that says every effect must have a cause, and of course that cause must have a cause, which must have a cause. And unless we want to carry on this way to infinity, there must be a self-caused cause at the beginning of things, a causa sui, which of course is what everyone means by God. That's cosmotheology. As is well known, Kant accepted the validity of neither ontotheology nor cosmotheology, dismantling the ontological, cosmological, and teleological proofs of God in fairly rapid succession, a feat for which Kant earned the title Der Allzermalmender, the all-destroyer, or the crusher of everything. But between the necessary postulates of Kant's second critique and the moral proof of God's existence in his religion within the limits of reason alone, Kant does reinstall God as a morally helpful presupposition, right? As the working hypothesis we need in order to follow the moral law. One could therefore argue that in order to guarantee the integrity of practical reason, Kant resorts to an ontotheological conception of God. Heidegger would certainly argue as much, not because of the way that Kant postulates a God, it's not an ontological proof, but because of the kind of God he postulates, an empty cosmic lawgiver flown in when the philosopher needs to close up some gaps in his system. One imagines Kant in his study thinking, God, I've done all of this, maxims, dispositional choice, I just need someone to give us the moral law in the first place, someone to get us going. God, great you could show up. So glad you're here. Yes, stand there, please. Just hold the moral law. Also, could you stand over here? Because there's always a bit of a gap between what we want to do and what we know we ought to do. I just need you, just here. Thank you so much. God. Right here, and you get the idea. And as far as Heidegger is concerned, it's not only Kant who capitulates to ontotheology, rather the whole edifice of Western metaphysics is constituted ontotheologically. By this he means two specific things. First, that the metaphysical concept of being is nothing more than a fuzzily conceived property that's supposedly common to all beings, the way that fruit is common to apples, pears, cherries, and grapes. Being as the being of beings. This is his language. This is the onto part of ontotheology. As he puts it in the OC, metaphysics thinks of beings as such, that is, in general, as a whole, as the ground-giving unity of what is most general, what's indifferently valid everywhere, and this is bad, right? At least you can tell that this is bad. This is not good. Right? Because again, metaphysics doesn't think being itself, or the difference between being and beings, just beings smushed together into an indistinct, fruity compound that it then calls being. Right? Second, to say that metaphysics is ontotheological is to say that this fruity substratum of pseudo-being is furthermore equated with a presumed highest being, which metaphysics then calls God. As Heidegger encapsulates it in this same essay, the essential constitution of metaphysics is based on the unity of beings as such in the universal and that which is highest. Right? These two things. Or as he puts it in the WB, because metaphysics represents beings as beings, it is two in one, the truth of beings in their universality and in the highest being. According to its nature, it is at the same time ontology in the narrower sense, that is, the bad sense, and theology. Now, Heidegger doesn't offer a diagram, but I thought it might be helpful to make one. This is pretty easy, right? The onto part of ontotheology refers to the ontology, which is to say beings in general, the sort of indistinct general run of stuff, right? Some sort of substratum we can say must lie beneath or behind or like within all beings. And then the theo part, theology, thinks in terms of one highest being, right? The self-caused cause, the unmoved mover, right? And then ontotheology smushes them together and says, right, God is being. Right? That's God. The thing that's common to all being, that is being, and being is God. Right? In short, the issue is that metaphysics as ontotheology conflates being, beings, and the highest being to such a baffling extent that it has no idea what it's talking about. And so we're back to the Heideggerian refrain. Because it is ontotheologically constituted, metaphysics can't think the being that sets it in motion. What Heidegger argues less often, but no less insistently, is that by equating being with the general run of beings and then identifying the whole mess with God, ontotheology does just as much disservice to God as it does to being. Unlike the God who delivers her people from slavery or proclaims good news to the poor, the God of metaphysics is merely the first being in a causal chain, the self-caused cause that prevents some dreaded infinite regress. All told, Heidegger laments, this is a bloodless and boring God, before whom man can neither pray nor dance, to whom he would never feel compelled to make a sacrifice. And the reason that man would not be inclined to give anything over to the causa sui is that this God is nothing more than a narcissistic projection of man in the first place. The human subject creates a conceptual God, gives him his lines, and pushes him out on stage at just the right time to secure, for example, the integrity of clear and distinct ideas, or the possibility of being a perfect moral agent. As Heidegger puts it, the deity can come into philosophy only insofar as philosophy of its own accord and by its own nature requires and determines that and how the deity enters into it. Right? Here, not there. Ontotheology, in short, is bad ontology and bad theology. It's a mirror game in which the human subject and its objectified God secure one another's conceptual integrity, each of them becoming in the mirror of the other a self-caused, self-identical, self-enclosed substance. Held in place by his divine prototype, the human subject as substance then goes on to turn the whole world into the object of his omnipotent thought. Now Heidegger himself, at least if we take him at his word, is strictly concerned with rehabilitating the ontological component of thinking. He's working toward ontology after ontotheology, or before ontotheology, right? After by going before ontotheology. theology after ontotheology will have to wait for differently stalwart souls like Jean-Luc Marion, Jack Caputo, and arguably Luce Regerai, whose work Professor Weil will address toward, I'm using my German, will address toward the end of the term. In different ways, all of these thinkers try to imagine what a God after the death of God might look like. But not Heidegger. As he insists throughout his lectures and his essays, being is not God. God is not being. And insofar as he's concerned with being, have you heard? He's concerned with being. He's not writing a theology. He's not written a theology. He has no intention ever to write a theology. But, as he told an audience in 1951, if he ever were to write a theology, quote, the word being ought not to appear there, unquote. Because again, who dances or sings or falls on her knees in the presence of that than which a greater cannot be thought? Who would ever write a hymn to the self-caused cause? I tried. The best I could come up with. A self-caused cause is Aquinas is God. Right, this is not, it went downhill from there. All other causes are caused by him. Like, this is bad. Nobody can sing this. And I think that something like this level of ridiculousness lies behind that strange moment in the WB essay when Heidegger suddenly asks, and one wonders whom he's asking, will Christian theology ever decide to listen to the Apostle Paul and declare that philosophy is foolishness? In other words, will anyone ever realize that theology has no business wedding itself to Greek ontology, that God is not being? Anyone other than me? Because have I made it clear? I'm not writing a theology. Again, the primary concern for Heidegger is to clear God away from being rather than to clear being away from God. The issue is to think being without conflating it with philosophy's highest being. And yet, as Heidegger admits, the godless thinking, which must abandon the God of philosophy, God as causa sui, is perhaps closer to the divine God. Here, this means only. Godless thinking is more open to him than ontotheologic would like to admit. Notice this language of openness, more open to him. Right? Godless thinking is open to God. Godless thinking doesn't try to prove the existence of God. It doesn't calculate God. It doesn't represent God. Godless thinking doesn't even think about God. And precisely in relinquishing its conceptual grasp on God, it remains strangely open to God as something that might break into it from outside itself, or which might not. And it's a similar story with being. God is not being. God has nothing to do with being. But the God beyond the God of the philosophers and the being beneath the being of beings are similarly concealed from the metaphysical tradition that conflates them. And so, just as remaining open to God is a matter of giving up the philosophical grasp on God, thinking the truth of being requires relinquishing calculation and representation, which is to say, relinquishing the philosophical subject who calculates and represents in the first place. If our thinking should succeed in its efforts to go back into the ground of metaphysics, Heidegger writes, it might well help to bring about a change in human nature accompanied by a transformation of metaphysics. It's to this change in human nature that we now turn. As we've already seen, the metaphysical effort to amass knowledge of beings occludes their condition of possibility. By reducing beings to items in a catalog or to resources for technological advancement, metaphysics misses and even obstructs the being that bees them to begin with. The upshot of this is that metaphysics itself ends up conferring the status of being upon beings. And of course, the only stuff that is, as far as metaphysics is concerned, is that which is useful and manipulable and calculable. All that is for metaphysics, is that which can be represented as an object to the thinking subject, and everything else is nothing. And what this means is that from the standpoint of metaphysics, being itself is nothing, because being is not a being. Being cannot be objectified or calculated, so it looks to metaphysics like nothing. And so the effect of metaphysics' determination of the being of beings is that metaphysics effectively refuses to let beings be. It reduces being itself to nothing, cutting beings off from their condition of possibility and adding them into this technological stockpile. If then another kind of thinking were to emerge, It would have to plunge into what looks like nothing from the standpoint of metaphysics, and this is what's so horrifying. This sort of thinking would have to recall philosophy's forgotten ground and find a way, he says, to experience being, this is his language, experience being as such, rather than being as metaphysically conferred. So the way out of metaphysics is the way down. Notice, if you will, the topographic difference here from Plato's allegory of the cave. We can talk more about this if you'd like, but the work of philosophy for Heidegger is not for the thinker to make his way out of the dark cave into the bright sun, but rather to move from the brightness of beings down into the dark ground, at which point, he says, thinking itself will be transformed. This is what Heidegger means when he writes that insofar as a thinker sets out to experience the ground of metaphysics, insofar as he attempts to recall the truth of being itself instead of merely representing beings as beings, his thinking has, in a sense, left metaphysics. From the point of view of metaphysics, such a thinking goes back into the ground of metaphysics. But what still appears as ground from this point of view is presumably something else once it's experienced in its own terms, something as yet unsaid, according to which the essence of metaphysics too is something else and not metaphysics. When we think of the truth of being, metaphysics is overcome. So again, the way down is the way out. Recalling the truth at the root of metaphysics would displace us beyond metaphysics. And Heidegger is careful to say here that this other kind of thinking, this new kind of thinking that he's looking for, wouldn't oppose metaphysics. After all, oppositions belong to metaphysics. Rather, he says, it goes back into the ground in order to leave it. And here, look at the way that he tries to wiggle his way out of Hegel. Right? He says, from the point of view of metaphysics, it looks like we're going back into the ground of metaphysics. It looks like this is just a reversal. It looks like I'm just saying no to your yes from the point of view of metaphysics. But from the point of view of the ground itself, things look completely different. The ground has never been thought as such, so when we're in it, we're doing something completely different. And I think this is ingenious, because the moment you say, Heidegger, your way back into the ground is still metaphysical, he can say, well, if it looks that way to you, then you're still metaphysical. Right? It's like the counter trick to Hegel's trick. Right? The minute you say this, you're not, don't quite get it. Right? At any rate, this new kind of thinking for Heidegger would be one that has dived all the way down into the essence of metaphysics, into the truth of being itself, and he tells us, once being is finally experienced in its own terms, right, we're doing something else. Metaphysics is overcome. Great. Looking forward to it. But how do we get to this ground? To return to our initial questions, how is thinking to think that without which thinking cannot think? How do we experience being in its own terms, when the only terms we have are metaphysical, when being persistently slips away from whatever it brings into being? Perhaps an easier way to frame this difficulty would be to point out that being is not an object. Right? And this is precisely why philosophy can't get at it. Being precedes the distinction of subject and object as such, and therefore does not present itself as an object to the representing subject. So it's not as though being lies there under the ground, under the metaphysical tree, waiting for some stalwart Heideggerian to go dig it up. Being isn't an object. To the contrary, being takes place. Being occurs. And being occurs as the process of what Heidegger calls unconcealment, which is to say, the bringing of beings into the light of being. Being occurs as the revealing of the unconcealed, but notice that of is a funny word. The revealing of the unconcealed means both the revealing of that which was concealed and the revealing that concealment itself does precisely by remaining concealed. And so being never presents itself as such. Rather, it takes place as a ceaseless double movement of revelation and concealment. And this is what Heidegger geeks mean when they say things like revealing is revealing. The idea is whatever appears by means of the withdrawal of that which enables its appearance. So even as it unconceals beings, being keeps itself concealed as being. And insofar as it keeps itself concealed, insofar as being never presents itself, thinking cannot represent it. Not being an object, being can't be grasped by a subject. So the task of thinking, in short, is to dislocate the subject. If thinking is to recall the self-concealing event of being, the thinker herself must be displaced, transported out of herself and into what looks like nothing, into the terrifying withdrawal of being. Socrates, Heidegger writes in another essay, did nothing else than place himself into this draft, this current, and maintain himself in it. He just stood there and held on. Conceived as substance, the metaphysical subject stands under himself, grounds himself, represents beings as objects of his self-established gaze. Displaced as Dasein, I've said it, the thinker stands out of herself in the opening of the being that both yields itself and withdraws. And Heidegger calls this disposition, here we go, an ecstatic instanding. Ecstasy literally means standing outside of oneself, and standing in means remaining with the incalculable, keeping oneself open to the self-concealing event of being, even though or precisely because it won't just present itself. So there's a kind of restraint here, a refusal to get the self together into a subject and a refusal to collapse beings into objects. Thinking, in short, requires a commitment to withstanding the indeterminacy of both thinker and thought. And Heidegger tells us that this withstanding, like being itself, takes place as a double movement. Just as being happens as revealing and reveiling, or as he puts it more tediously in the OC, do I not have it here? Quote, the perdurance of, we can go to the tree is nice. Just as being happens as a revealing and a reveiling, or as he puts it more tediously in the OC, the perdurance of unconcealing overcoming and of self-keeping arrival, right? You can hear this, the out and the back movement. Just as being is both given and withdrawn, Dasein takes place as an ecstatic standing in, a movement out and back, which the WB maps onto being toward death on the one hand, that's the ecstasis, and care on the other, that's the instasis. Out on the one hand to finitude and singularity, and in on the other to worldliness and relationships. Maintaining itself in this irreducible between out and back, self and world, singular and multiple, thinking holds itself in the placeless place behind, beyond, or beneath the oppositions of metaphysics. It stands in the very opening that metaphysics closes down into subject and object, dark and light, ground and consequent, and even being versus beings. And this is the reason the OC calls this placeless place not light or ground or being, because all of these are already bound up with their metaphysical opposites, but difference itself. Thinking for Heidegger holds itself in this opening, in the hopes of opening a new beginning for thinking. A thinking that, rather than amassing and instrumentalizing beings, might let being be. And it is in this particular sense that thinking would become the work of existing itself, of standing open for the openness in which we stand by standing it. Thank you. I'd keep it concise because I can't say being anymore. It starts sounding, you know when you say the same word over and over again and it stops? Cereal often does that to me. Cereal. I have no idea what cereal is right now. No idea. Alles klar. Yes?
This ecstatic instanding sounds like Heidegger wants to take us to that place that we heard about last week's lecture, in the divide between the knower and the known that Hegel thinks he closed. Would Heidegger say that's not closed simply because Hegel doesn't account for being and treats it only as beings, or is there another reason there?
Right, good. Thank you for that. Yeah, he's not trying to close the gap between, say, being and beings or darkness and light, which for Heidegger is what Hegel is trying to do. What he's trying to do is to get back behind the distinction and see where it opens in the first place. And this, he says, is going to be something new, right? What Hegel has for Heidegger is the sum of everything that's already been thought. So you've got knower and known, object and subject, great. finite consciousness and infinite consciousness, smush, fantastic. It's the sum of everything. And Heidegger wants to say that sum of everything depends on something that it's never been able to access. And that's where I'm trying to take us. So rather than additive, this is, I don't know what you call it. It's differential, right? He's trying to get to the differential condition that enables those things to be in the first place. It's kind of temporal difference. Right? But the thing that's funny about the temporal difference is that, again, once you get back to this condition, you're in some new place. So the way back sort of leaps you forward into something totally different. So the way forward is the way back, just as the way back is the way down, and the way down is the way out. It's now that I break into liturgical dance. Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you. In the back, hi.
Forgive me if it was about the Atlas question, but once we get into the ground,
yeah,
which is presumably the point,
yeah,
what is the world that opens then? I mean, what is, I suppose, the point?
Right.
And where do we begin?
Yeah. So in these essays, Heidegger says, I'm preparing the leap, right? I'm trying to get us ready to go, and so I'm just showing us the way. I'm not there yet, we're not there yet, we're not going. He doesn't know, and as the later texts make clear, he has no idea, and even if he does, he can't represent it, right? He can't tell you. At one point he says, at the beginning of one of his lecture series, you know, I know, so the mood of all thinking for Heidegger should have been wonder, of all philosophical, should have been wonder, but it collapsed into curiosity. So what philosophy has done is it's been curious about things, and it's amassed knowledge of beings, and it's moved from one thing to the other, right? And Heidegger says at one of his lectures, we need a different mood for thinking. And I know what it is, but I'm not going to tell you. Because unless you're there, you can't know about it. Because he's worried that the words are going to betray him, right? That they'll collapse back into, metaphysics is amazing, right? And he says at another point, metaphysics can't be abolished like an opinion. You can't just get rid of it, right? But we can try to find some different way of thinking. And he says, so I don't know, I can't represent for you what that thinking is going to look like, but the way to it is there, right? And I think that the thing that's crucial is, what it's going to mean is holding, it becomes kind of affective, right? Holding oneself as a thinker in the indeterminate. Just being willing not to know, right? Not to know what exactly the difference is between this and that, or what that thing is that's coming to me, and just holding itself. And he starts in some of his later work saying, maybe the last God will come then, right? The God who will finally save us and deliver us from metaphysics. I don't know what's going to happen there, but at least something else might break in. Because the problem with philosophy is that it thinks that it's got everything calculated ahead of time, so nothing new can come at all, because it's got everything thought ahead of time. Nothing new can come. So he's trying to bring us into a place where something new might come, and from there he says, that last God might come to save us or might come to obliterate us. I have no idea. And this is where his thinking becomes quite dangerous, right? You have no idea what's coming at you if you just sort of hold yourself in the indeterminate. But it's, I guess, newness is what he's looking for. Just something new. Let's play a different game. Let's do something else. Because this one has not done well for us. Thanks. Hi.
You talk about Dasein in terms of the ecstatic instanding.
Mm-hmm.
When Heidegger talks about Dasein, does he mean just that, or is there some different?
It's so funny when I said that I was going to talk about Heidegger, I said to a number of people, and I'm not going to mention Dasein. I'm just not going to say it. I'm not going to say it at all. So his understanding. So Dasein is the word Heidegger uses to refer to usually human being. There are people who will argue that this being extends to non-human creatures as well. I don't know that that's, I mean, you can make the point, but I don't think it's consistent in Heidegger. So it's the word he uses for human being, for what it means for a human to be, right? And the term, right, da, there, sein, being there, right? And then his description of what this being there looks like changes as the texts go on. And there are tons of different ways that he talks about it. But I think the thing that runs, so ecstatic instasis is new. This is in the 40s and 50s, and then he ditches that too. The thing that runs through his different descriptions of how Dasein takes place, I would argue, is that Dasein is always standing in a between. It's always occupying an intermediate space, right? Between, say, self and world. This is usually how being and time places it. And I don't want to, I'm reluctant because to say Dasein stands between self and world makes it sound as though there's a self that's constituted first, and then there's a world, and then and then Dasein stands between it, and that's not it. It's the betweenness itself that opens the distinction between self and world. So self and world is one way that he puts it. Dasein holds itself between birth and death, right? Between singularity, its own most non-relational possibility, it itself, that nothing else can do for it on the one hand, and sort of care and relations on the other. Gods and man, as he puts it in some of his texts, the Dasein stands between gods and man. He starts later talking about this fourfold between earth and sky and man and divinity, and Dasein holds itself there. But it's always this funny holding. Does that help? Yeah. Thanks. Hi.
Just on that, is Dasein then independent of those things it stands between, or is it created by some sort of process of
right? So it's one of the things that's so frustrating about Heidegger. There are so many things that are so frustrating about Heidegger. One of them is that he does all of this work to demolish what one might call a kind of anthropocentric notion of the exalted human subject, and then he just reinstalls it in another key. And this is one of them. He, especially as the works go on, he starts calling Dasein the shepherd of being, as though it's up to Dasein to make sure being happens, right? So I don't like that, but this is that's increasingly the way that he begins to talk. He begins to talk about man as the unconcealer of beings, as the one who does this in the first place. And he starts rereading Plato's Cave a number of times. And in one of his rereadings of Plato's Cave, he says, what this is trying to say is that the prisoner, this is the cave sky. The prisoner who breaks his chains and manages to turn around, see the stuff, and then get dragged out of the cave into the light, and then come back down into the cave and rule benevolently the cave. What this is saying is that the happening of truth itself, just the occurrence of anything, right, anything true, is going to depend on the liberation of this one man and the way that he's able to, and this is the conception of Dasein here, to hold himself between the open of the sky and the world of the cave. And by holding that between, he's able to say, aha, this is what our city should look like. This is what our soul should look like. This is what gazing at the forms and looking down. So I don't know. I don't know if it helps. Yeah. Thanks. Hi.
When you talk about sort of like Heidegger, the metaphysics is causing this kind of through its kind of through in the end it ends up. Wait, what am I saying? I'm saying. Okay, Heidegger rejects metaphysics because he feels like it reduces sort of, what would be things that be to commodities. Mm-hmm. And I was like, it seemed to me like his leap from the conceptualization of that kind of being to like, this is the real world, like, consequences of this. It just seems like a kind of very unsupported leap. Or did he have like more like arguments backing that up? Or?
So you're having a hard time making the leap from sort of history of philosophy on the one hand to iPhones on the other. Is that the? Yeah. A better argument. No, he just talked about it a lot, right? And he did both of these things. So he would in the question concerning technology, for example, bits of the letter on humanism. He'll talk about the way that these strands of thinking have had these sort of real-term effects. You dam a river in order to hold it for energy. And this, he says, is only possible if you're thinking about that river as an object in the first place, right? Why would we ever think about a river as an object? And the reason we would think about a river as an object, Hegel says, is the whole history of thought has only thought in terms of objects. So the exercise he engages in more is in trying, in a kind of anti-Hegelian Hegelianism, to map the history of philosophy in terms of its increasing thingification of beings, objectification of beings. He sometimes calls on different people, and he goes, but it's always a straightforward trajectory from Plato sort of through iPhones.
So is there like relationship more so like an association than like a cause and effect kind of thing?
Yeah, good. He's not saying, because Kant thought this way, Steve Jobs designed that. He's not saying that at all. What he's saying is all of this is a sign that we're not thinking well, right? And our not thinking well is a sign that being has left us. So these are all different symptoms of the same problem. Thank you. Hi.
So I guess to keep this in or exactly what it was called, but there was that statement from the CERN laboratory recently that a smaller subatomic particle than whatever the most recent small subatomic particle may have been discovered. I mean, do you see this as instances of this sort of ontotheology and what, I mean, the way most of science, but particularly popular science, works as trying to institute the scientific origin of moral categories or a God particle. What could a science look like that doesn't do that aside from a principle of insufficient cause?
Right, that's lovely. That's lovely. Yeah, I think that Heideggerians can have a field day with the beautiful experiments at CERN. I mean, they're doing amazing things. They created the plasma, right? The first plasma that seems to have come forth out of the Bang. They see it, and they had thought it was a gas, and it turns out it's a liquid, and this is really interesting, right? And they're threatening to swallow the whole, cosmos in a black hole and things like that. So they're playing these origin games, and they're beautiful and they're amazing. And yeah, I think that Heidegger would say this is a really interesting place to look and to see calculative representational thought in service of some kind of understanding of sort of disavowed understanding of what God might be, right? Either the God particle, what banged the bang, what was it that brought here? And you don't even have to go there. You can think about any of the efforts, particularly on the part of particle physicists, to find a grand unified theory of everything, right? These efforts to know everything. And I think a really great critic of this is the physicist Marcello Gleiser. Do you know him? He's at Dartmouth. He's brilliant. And he criticizes contemporary physics as relentlessly ontotheological. He says this is monotheistic science, right? The effort to find one thing that's going to unify everything. Quantum theory and general relativity don't look like they're going to work together, but they must. Why must they? Because there has to be one. Aha, that's monotheism, right? In that sense, that's a sort of lingering monotheism back there. So Gleiser has ideas for how science might proceed, and the idea basically is not to assume from the outset that this all fits together into one coherent scheme, right? To think that there might be just different ways of accounting for the universe, or for the pluriverse, or the multiverse.
Doing away with the idea of internal physical laws whatsoever?
No. Just doing away with the so Gleiser thinks, for example, that string theory has undermined itself. But there are so many hopes on string theory because string theory is going to reconcile general relativity and quantum mechanics if it works. But it doesn't seem to be doing that, and yet all these resources are going into string theory to try to do it because there has to be a way of doing it. And Gleiser says, let's do something else. Let's talk about the way that rocks were formed. I can tell you about the way that rocks were formed. Right? So he's not getting rid of calculative representational thinking at all, but he's getting rid of the notion that all of this is ultimately going to make us lords of creation because we're going to know the whole thing. Right? There's a kind of self-deification in that effort to try to find a theory of everything. And this is at least what Gleiser is critiquing, and I think I commend him to you. It's great. The book is called A Tear at the Edge of Creation. Cool. Jonathan? Hi.
That was fabulous. I feel like now to go to parties and say I know a little bit about Heidegger. So on the basis of what you said, one of the things that comes up a lot with Heidegger is his relationship to ethics and politics in a way, and that some of this, one to think in terms of campus and service learning and the Center for the Humanities in Heidegger. I'll do it quick. That in service.
Can we talk about particle physics? Can we talk about particle physics instead?
Just shift gears real fast.
Yeah.
if
No,
you can. No. He's got this critique of like reification and instrumentalization that you were talking about. That sort of says like back off, let the would be, the BB and the would be, and let it. I didn't mean to go there. So, which sounds at one level, so like, if there's an ethics against the violence of that technology, the violent imposition in the challenging forth, right, which is a violence, and he's saying, in the holding and the caring, there is a standing back and a waiting and making room for the other and the whatever. But it sounds at another level like, well, easy for you to say, that your ethics is kind of standing back when there's urgent action needed, and so that's what I was doing with service learning and the Center for the Humanities, which is admittedly
so I'm going to steer clear of service learning and the Center for the Humanities. So I mean this is immense, and I mean the just to look at the elephant, right? The critique of Heidegger is usually, well, what use is all of this if it causes you or leads you or is not incompatible with your having joined the Nazi Party in 1933? Why did you do that? Couldn't you have made a different decision? Right? And the most compelling and challenging to this argument that I've come across is it comes actually from Hannah Arendt. I don't know if we're getting a Hannah Arendt lecture.
Yes,
soon, which is wonderful. Yeah, and some it's not even right. So, comes from Hannah Arendt. So, as is well known, Heidegger never explained what was going on, never explained why he signed the paper, why he, was a bad Nazi for a couple, but a Nazi, like why he did this. No apology, no excuse, no anything. And the most compelling account I have found is in an address that Hannah Arendt writes for Heidegger's 80th birthday. And she says, gosh, Heidegger, it was amazing to be in Germany back then in the 20s because he was just this massive thinker, and people were saying, he's a thinker, there's a teacher, you can go learn with this person and he'll teach you something. And people were clustering around him the way people must have clustered around Kant, Plato. I mean, she ranks him as like huge philosophical giants. And she says in this address, the disaster was that he made such horrifying political decisions, and now we're sort of stuck trying to figure out what it was that did that, what it was that caused that encouraged that. And her answer that I find I can't even get away from, her answer is that Heidegger had too much wonder. That he had too much wonder. He was too willing to hold himself in that indeterminacy and go, wow, right? And that he wasn't able to take himself out of the clouds and into the real world. Right? He was anticipating, it seemed, like some sort of metaphysical revolution at the hands of National Socialism, and he just couldn't see what it was actually doing. So he wasn't looking at storefronts, he was thinking about his metaphysical revolution. And this is the problem, Arendt says, that he got sort of stuck in wonder. And this is a philosopher's problem. She compares him to, there's this old story about Thales, the astronomer philosopher, who apparently was so excited about the stars and was gazing at the stars that he fell into a well under his feet. And a passing Thracian maid says like, aha, you want to know what's in the stars, you can't see what's in your own. And Hannah Arendt is what happened to Heidegger, right? He's looking at the stars and he can't see what's beneath his own feet. I'm sorry, this isn't overly long, but I think it's important. And so the question, at least for me, for somebody who's thought about wonder a fair amount, is what this betweenness of Dasein really means. And as far as I can tell, even in Heidegger's most anthropocentric and sort of annoying writings later on, he says over and over again that the task of thinking is to hold itself between the open and the cave. Like you have to be able to see both of these very clearly. And so for me, it seems like the failure was not so much, and that is the work for Heidegger of wonder, the out and back constantly, right, the out and back. And so it seems to me that the problem wasn't so much that he got lost in wonder. The problem that he was that he wasn't wondering the right way, and the right way being the stuff that comes out of his own work. Because the stuff that comes out of his own work is this holding between. And had he been able even just to look around him and see what it was that was happening, right? Had he held himself to that concrete principle of the between, there couldn't have, this decision couldn't have emerged. So I think he sort of failed to live up to his own thinking. And so that's my way of seeing it, is that if you're really rigorous about this between, you are rigorously attentive to the everyday, rigorously attentive to the goings on in the cave. You're not trying to get out of it. Heidegger himself said this: don't get out of the cave. You got to come back down, right? So yeah. So I think there's a failure here to live up to his own thinking, and this is I think in line with the kind of thing that Derrida says in that essay called Heidegger, the Philosopher's Hell, where he says, look, there are lots of Nazi ideologues out there. They wrote a lot of books. We don't read them. Why don't we read them? Because they're Nazi ideologues. But there's something about Heidegger's philosophy that resists that. And there's some sense that this is not that. And that's why we keep reading him. So anyway, really long answer. That's where I go with that. So I support the Center for the Humanities. And yes, and
rigorously
yeah. Oh yeah, I see. Yes, good. Thank you. I see where you're going. Thanks.
If I can push that over a second.
Yeah.
We know Charles Mill has a book, The Racial Contract.
Yeah.
When he looks at philosophy, he says that you look at all different philosophical concepts. And the thing that one of the central themes of philosophy, that is race, you don't find being sort of discoursed about into philosophy.
Right.
So that it doesn't seem like this is particular to Heidegger. Right? You can go back to Aristotle's theory of natural slavery. Sure. And if you look at, say, for example, in the U.S. context, I think of someone like Jefferson, who was a great, he may not be a philosopher, certainly intellectual, but his discourse on the indigenous people and his action on indigenous people, especially after 1763, and then, of course, on slavery. In Virginia, this is not. You want to go back to Heidegger's notion of ontotheological tradition, it seems like there has always been this other form of this.
Yeah, and I think that this is something that Arendt gets really nicely in her essay, which is this is always a problem with philosophy. And no, philosophy doesn't, the sort of dominant Western strand of metaphysics does not talk well when it talks about race at all, or it doesn't talk well about race, but it doesn't talk much about race at all. What it does do is it sets the metaphorics in place, light over dark, right, that then get mapped onto disastrous political endeavors, right? And this is so it's not even as though philosophy's not addressing race is somehow just a non-engagement. It's an engagement, right? And it's a violent engagement because these terms carry freight and they have meaning. So it does do race even though it doesn't do race. And I think that this is what we've talked a little bit about this sometimes, that this is why that Toni Morrison piece about playing in the dark is so fantastic, because philosophy is not thinking about race. It's not thinking about race, but it's not thinking about race. I think there's always that haunting there. And the work that it's doing is complicit in the very formations that it's not, that it's trying to keep itself.
Hi. This is just sort of naive, but thinking. Why is thinking the way in which Heidegger conceives philosophy or wisdom? And can you say anything about what thought means? And the reason I'm asking is because when I follow this line of thought, one place it might lead to is letting go of thinking as such that is sort of trying to get a handle on it. I mean, all of our metaphors for thought stick us in the subject getting a grasp on the object stance. So think about, say, Buddhists who would go through a lot of these dichotomous things and say, right, you don't hold yourself in the in-between with thought, you let go of the thought. So how would Heidegger vindicate presenting his project in terms of thinking, and might that be a mistake that would explain why he doesn't turn to engagement or participation or some of the other alternatives to?
Yeah, that's lovely. And there's a book called What is Called Thinking that might that might be the way to go. But just quickly, as you're picking up on, Heidegger is preferring the term thinking over philosophy. So philosophy is clear that, and yes, and so thinking initially for him is a better word to get at the loosening the conceptual grasp. So philosophy does is it tries to grasp big things, it tries to hold it. And thinking somehow can sort of place itself into the withdrawal. Is there still a remnant of the transcendental subject there, the thinker who thinks? Yes, absolutely. I think that this is why later on in his life, Heidegger switches into Gelassenheit, letting be, which is a much less active. But at this point, he makes sort of the opposite mistake and starts saying things like, philosophers can have nothing to do with the real world. We just can't. We have no idea. We just, you get out, you get blinded by being, and you get back into the cave, you can't see anymore, and you just can't do anything. So I don't even find that there's much political hope in that total relinquishment.
But there might be a third term, which is to think about something like participation or engagement or activity, which is very much alive and embodied, and it's partly, I guess, leading us to some of the other thinkers later in this series.
Yeah, and which would take more seriously relation. I mean, there's again, this is a place where Heidegger just doesn't deliver on what he promises on. It is Heidegger who says, being is fundamentally in the world, being is fundamentally with. And then he says, and so, being your death is your own most non-relational possibility of being. And then you think, how can you have that? So there's a promise of relation in Heidegger that doesn't get out. And I keep going back to these illustrations of his rereading of the cave because I think they're helpful. No matter how many times he tells this cave story, there's never a moment when the cave blames, the cave blows, teach the philosopher anything. There's never a moment. He talks at them, and they either understand or they don't understand. Or he can drag them up the slope so that they can see something. But there's never any truth of the cave here. There's never any, he can try to tune out their chatter or call it chatter, but it doesn't ever teach anything. And I think that's where you need to go. Into that, you need to reconceptualize the cave there. Like what does the philosopher learn from the cave dwellers, rather than just sort of gazing at the forms and saying, okay, let's do it that way. That's the real world. Let's do it that way. Yeah. So I don't know what you'd call that. I don't know what you'd call that thing. You need to pull Heidegger and find a new word. But yeah, make up a new word. Anything in German?
To what Elise just said about thinking as this sort of very active appropriation of an object, it seems to me that in the later Heidegger, in particular, the problem is more that you end up in some sort of state of simply pious repetition, where thinking sort of gives up on itself, where this sort of Gelassenheit or letting be is actually an application of thinking, and also an applicating of all responsibility. And this is, I think, why the later Heidegger is so maddening. And then you have this strange appropriations of sort of poetic or pseudo-poetic discourse. He does write dialogues.
Yeah.
It's a very peculiar
Walk
dialogue.
with me as we pass together.
Yeah. So there is sort of the sense that something that should have happened just doesn't really happen. The whole thing, in the end, seems like a missed opportunity a little bit.
Yeah.
There's a sense of melancholy, disappointment. Right?
Yeah, no, it's totally tragic. I find the whole process tragic.
Wow.
On that note.
You know,
Thank you so much.